Last year, before the Vasa, and then and he's from Texas originally. Been in Abhayagiri about almost 3 years now, and another monk who's coming to stay here. His name is Tangino, and I've lived with both of these monks before. Tangino is actually from Temple Monastery, originally from Massachusetts, and both of them are fairly young monks. I think they're still in their 20s.
Close,
Yeah,
at least.
close, late 20s. Yeah, very lovely, very nice monks, and so they'll get here April 4th, and they'll probably stay for 3 months and head back to Abhayagiri for the Vasa. I think that's the plan.
And I'll be parting ways.
Yes, eventually Nisabho will be parting, but not because he's disgruntled or
I'm very gruntled, not disgruntled. Yeah, it's been good being here.
Very good time together. Yeah. We met originally in Australia. I don't know if we've told people that, when we were both living at Bodhiwana together. So that was a very nice experience.
Actually, Arjun, the first time we met was when I stopped at Abhayagiri, and Arjun was seminal in terms of getting me to ordain, but he forgot.
I don't remember our meeting. Apparently we spent 3 hours together.
Yeah, I was driving down the coast looking for grad schools and just binging on podcasts and Top 40 radio, and just sort of at the height of searching for some distraction because something didn't quite feel right in life. And then I stopped at Abhayagiri, and it quickly was clear that I really needed that form, and I was so inspired. And then Ajahn Junda was waiting there, and I just had sort of talked to him. I was like, I would be interested in, doing a retreat for a while. And he's like, well, here's a paper on how we ordain people, just in case, which was the push I kind of needed to come to Thailand eventually. But then he forgot, so. But I'm still very grateful.
You're one of so many.
You've ushered.
Yeah, I guess that happens with age. You sort of start to lose those memories. So I think it's the hair. If I could imagine you like maybe in the whatever your getup was, where you're like more into sort of hippie or grunge, or you're kind of, and you had hair, then I would have.
There's only one picture of me floating around online, and I'm not going to tell people what that is.
Okay. Well, yeah. So anyway, I can't quite remember, but anyway, I'm glad it got you to be a monk.
Me too, Ajahn. Thank you.
Good. So then, anyway, Australia was our second time together after that brief time, and now I've been here living quite well. I will miss Nisabho, but there's still quite a lot of time left. Either one of us could die before that time anyway. So, so we'll be having a community of 4 in less than 2 weeks now. And that's that. I think people have also possibly heard that Ajahn Sranto is not going to be coming back. I guess this is the time for announcements.
For a while.
Sorry. He will be coming back eventually. But as part of his sabbatical, he's decided to stay on at Abhayagiri until probably at least November or December. And it could be longer. But he's going to end up building this, or helping to build this kuti and overseeing that project. That was supposed to be this April, but due to several reasons, one in terms of funding, another in terms of just now possibly hiring an architect to overlook it, so he's not having to take on that responsibility. These are some things that are being looked at right now, and then the new plan is to probably build this senior monks kuti in April of 2022. Probably start at that point. And so we'll see. Things are being discussed, and we're looking into what we're going to do. So that's the news from the monastery.
Shall we, Ajahn?
Yes, I guess we can get into the Dhamma now.
No, it's good to update everyone.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions. Perhaps we could start with Marilyn's. How about praise and blame? Why do I keep praising and blaming myself?
Oh.
Ajahn, take it away.
That's a very thick. That's a lot of what I work with. I think many people work with. Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about this in one of the other live streams around praise and blame as a worldly wind, and they're a pair. And if you think about 2,500, 2,600 years ago, the Buddha was talking about these, and they're still present in. It's not like we've resolved the problems of praise and blame, but it is something that's spoken about quite a lot in society now. And we can see it sort of, it can move into extreme forms if you look at like the internet now and how sort of blame culture is, and cancel culture and things about like kind of just really alienating people, and also just praising, and how we seek praise, and that's not always a very healthy thing to be looking to get. It's a part of our life. It's a part of who we are, and how we deal with the world, unfortunately. But they're not seen as benevolent or beautiful forces. They're seen as something that unfortunately cause us a lot of dukkha, and we do, because we're used to externalizing those things, we're also very used to internalizing them. So that would be, again, it's not so normal for us to have, I think, a negative aspect around praising ourselves. It's sort of rare that somebody has come to me and said, I have this big problem with praising myself. There can be egotistical responses, but for the most part, a lot of people are self-doubting and working around a lot of negativity towards themselves, and that's where the blame comes in. And then we compare ourselves to others, and we think they're so great, and we want to praise them, and on the circle goes. As I'm speaking, you might say that you understand this, and you can find that you have a lot in common with these two worldly winds, but they're really a part of just sort of the social makeup. I think they're a lot of how we live as human beings, and it'd probably be hard to find a society that's bereft of praise and blame. And interestingly enough, like it's I would encourage people to praise themselves if they can. If they're leaning towards blame, then definitely kind of praise in terms of looking at oneself, as like, what are the positive qualities that I actually have that are, realistically, that are good, that are helpful for me, and to actually bring those things up. Again, that doesn't seem to be a problem of people doing that too much for themselves. It could be, but it's not the usual problem. Whereas we tend to just look at ourselves from like microscopically examining ourselves and criticizing, and it's just not very helpful. It goes back to the inner tyrant and what we've spoken about in that regard, and I was just speaking to someone yesterday about that, how it's good to really acknowledge, when we have these negative emotions about ourselves or others, to acknowledge that and not try to push it away, but just to know it. And as we've spoken about with metta, that is that kind of just knowing, acknowledging, allowing these negative experiences to be within us, but also knowing that they're not actually helping us. And it doesn't also help to kind of push them away, to suppress them, but it is good to think about how we're actually creating them, and allowing them to take on a life of their own. So in a sense, we want to learn how to work with praise and blame, especially that seeking of praise from other people, and then also that sort of kind of avoiding blame, running away from it, either or kind of running towards it within our own mind, how we use it towards ourselves. So that's sort of a start to the topic. That's just, I think, touching into it. What are your thoughts to add on to that?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a huge topic. I mean, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha has a whole chapter where he just speaks about the dangers of praise and blame. A cruel, bitter thing is praise and blame, and then he compares a monk overcome with it to a dung beetle.
Right.
Very excited about his pile of dung. So he criticized it with pretty strong imagery, because I think he saw the attraction. And of the four, what we call the four worldly winds: pleasure, pain, gain, loss, uh, praise and blame, fame and disrepute. It's interesting that two of those pairs are more or less different ways of speaking to praise and blame because it's so powerful. And you think of our evolutionary history, and on the surface, it can seem like the other two worldly winds of gain and loss and um, pleasure and pain are the deepest ones, but actually, um, being tribal animals, if we were exiled from the group, we were dead. And so it's such a profoundly deep instinct that I think having genuine compassion for ourselves around the constant buffeting we receive from those winds at a very deep level, it's important. And because it really is a huge factor. And my sense is that the Buddha spoke of four nutriments for that we or what's a good way of putting this, for four nutriments where we sort of gain sustenance and depend on, and it's contact, um, and intellectual intention, sankhara, consciousness, and then like physical food, for the existence of a being. And um, I think praise and blame fall into this realm of intellectual intention of sankhara, of like ways that we reify the self, and put ourselves down, pump ourselves up. You know, in terms of praising and blaming ourselves, it's ways we crystallize the self again and again. And my experience is that what the path does and what meditation does is it allows us to gain more and more nourishment from the other bases of nutriment of consciousness and feeling, in terms of very wholesome states of consciousness and feeling, say the state of peace and the good feeling that comes, or contact, sorry, that comes from, living a life that's pure and in line with our purpose. And the more and more, like the more we come into practice and meditation, I think the more you can sense those constant need to crystallize the self fading away a bit, and you just fall into like this felt sense of what I think Longpo Sumedho terms intuitive awareness, and the sense of what one needs to do in a sort of a more stable pleasure or more stable sense of well-being. And as one gains that more and more, I think not only do praise and blame one shake one less, but also one feels less need to constantly be proliferating around praising and blaming oneself, because one has a foundation in this felt sense of Dhamma. And I know Longpo Panyavado, a really famous teacher in Thailand, says that, or said that, one good measure of uh, if our practice is progressing is a genuine sense of self-worth, not in a worldly way, but in the sense that we have a purpose and something to give to the world. And my sense is that that sort of felt sense um, is much deeper and more robust and somehow separate from the sort of surface level, uh, kilesa-ridden, defilement-ridden praise and blame. But it's such a big topic. It's like very hard to, yeah. So I'd say for me, just developing meditation and stepping deeper into this path is the best antidote, along with spreading loving kindness to oneself.
Yeah, I think speaking about nutriment, you can kind of see it as a simile of like when we know there's foods that are good for us and there's foods that are not so good for us, and you think about like you might know that, but you keep consuming the food that isn't healthy for you, and possibly like into an area of like, well, it's pleasurable in one way, but it has a negative effect on you. And I think similarly, as we're talking about with a nutriment, and you had mentioned about sankhara, Nisabho, it's really like when you think about trying to kind of run away from blame or to seek praise, it's really like a consuming energy, right? Like you're trying to get something, you're trying to search for something and have something and feed yourself, fill yourself up with something. And it's again, because these are worldly winds, they're worldly, and we are trying to actually move ourselves more towards the stream of Dhamma rather than the stream of the world. So that, if one actually kind of can put oneself in situations where you are actually seeking praise from another person, or a group of people, it's really like, unfortunately, like I think most of us know, it's not a pleasant experience. It is, again, trying, like, sort of self-aggrandizement, but it's in a way that, yeah, it's very much like, seeking something that's not beneficial for us, because we're then having to depend on another person for, kind of our own belief in ourself and our own self identity, and then we're dependent on that, so that we can't actually have confidence in our own abilities, and especially with the practice of Dhamma. So when we are practicing Dhamma in the right way, I think then that kind of, essentially, that dependence can fall through, and we can see it quite clearly. And then the possibility is that when that natural habit of seeking praise from others, for example, or trying to run away from blame, we see that as like an imposter, sort of. That can be a moment of Mara, I see you, like going after something that doesn't actually have sustenance for us. It's something that actually is like poison, and that's another way that the worldly winds can be compared to, as like poisons. And it's, so it's a bit of a conundrum, like, why do we seek something that's poisonous for us? But I think it goes back to, like, again, like, why do we seek sensuality as the answer to, the pleasure that we want to have, rather than the pleasure that we gain through understanding our own minds and understanding the Dhamma. And so that kind of seeking after these kind of negative experiences, these negative encouragements from other people, how we should be regarded by them. It's something, I think, to just be very careful of, to be heedful around, and to experiment with when we have that intention to move towards that seeking, or that running away, the running away from blame. And again, I come back to that, allowing those experiences to be present when we do find ourselves moving towards those habits that are quite unskillful, and to just kind of say, okay, what is going on here? And when you ask yourself that question, you kind of start looking into it, you allow that experience to be there, then you have a way to see, like, okay, there's an alternative, because that goes back to kind of the hook and the bait, and like we're seeing that there's bait, we're seeing that there's kind of something there that we want to grasp at. There's something that, like, we have, obviously we wouldn't seek praise and run away from blame if it didn't have some positive effect on us, but unfortunately the positive effect is ephemeral, it doesn't last, it's not helpful, it's unbeneficial, but in the short run it feels good, just like sensuality. So I think we want to kind of put ourselves in that tough spot of, like, well, wait a minute, like, how can I not actually seek praise? How can I be in a situation with somebody else where I'm okay with not knowing how they feel about me, or I'm okay with them knowing that I actually made a mistake, and actually being courageous enough to put ourselves in situations that we will be blamed. I know that there's some famous stories where Master Hua, who was a Chinese teacher, very famous Chinese teacher, who helped actually start a Baigiri monastery, donating the land there. And he started a city of 10,000 Buddhas. Many of you probably know that. He occasionally, as I understand, would blame some of his students for things that they didn't do. And to kind of have them work with that, they didn't necessarily know that he was doing that intentionally at the time, but was their first response to defend themselves and say, I didn't do that, and that wasn't true? Or were there possibly some rare students who just kind of accepted that And maybe they later corrected him or let him know, but at the time they said, okay, thank you for, letting me know that this was a problem, and, I need to look at this. That would be very hard. I don't know how many of you have actually faced. I've probably done it very rarely, and certainly when I've had people blame me for something that I didn't do, I was, it's not true. So it's a really good way to be able to look at how we face those worldly winds, how we face like praise, for example. Are we able to accept it from other people, or are we able to notice when we seek it and not go and seek it? Those are kind of the ways I think are helpful in terms of working with those two worldly winds.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic.
It is.
Like,
it
it's
is.
really close to, I think, all of us.
Yeah.
And a wound that keeps on giving. How about this question, Ajahn? Sumana asks, is there a specific approach you would suggest for sitting with difficult decisions? How meditation fits in this picture when it seems mostly like thinking? Ajahn?
Well, I just spoke for a while.
Okay.
Unless you're having a hard decision.
No,
to
it's
make.
good. It's good. It's my way of thinking about things is getting Ajahn Cunda to go first. No, I'm glad to try to speak to it.
Now I know.
No, yeah, there you go.
Okay, it's
The
been revealed.
No, I mean, this is yeah, I know some teachers recommend writing it down on a pad like the question, and just somehow that lets it, part for me of the mind running around an issue that is coming up is the sense of not wanting to kind of forget certain points about it, say, and even something like an argument or various points from of in the decision, and just writing it down kind of lets it out for a bit. So sometimes I'll do that in meditation. But also as a hindrance, the fifth hindrance of vicikicca, skeptical doubt. The one almost never comes to a conclusion through that, because the hindrance is self-sustaining. And I think one useful way to look at the ordering of the Four Noble Truths is that, there's the direction to acknowledge and look at and comprehend suffering, to see the cause of suffering, to realize the cessation piece, and then after that to develop the path out of suffering. And one interesting way of looking at that is, and I think most of us have this experience, is only from those places of calm, the third noble truth, that sort of basis of peace, does one see the path. And my sense is, with these decisions, when we engage with them from the normal place of the hindrance, there's no, resolution. And so it's much, I think, more effective to look at the suffering behind, or the agitation, the stress behind the mind state, and, look at where it's manifesting in the body or something like this, or just try to bring the mind to some state of calm, and then the problem usually dissolves, and the path through that problem, the sort of Dhammic path, becomes very apparent. But in terms of skillful means, I mean, I think skeptical doubt's a huge one for us, and skillful means that have worked, that I've heard of working, include visualizing both decisions in front of one in two separate spaces, and then turning the body towards each, and seeing where the somatic sense kind of resonates in a good way. And I think this is something we gain through breath meditation, is an awareness of the body. And they say the chitta, the mind heart, really resides in the body and the torso. And intuitive awareness, Longpo Sumedho says, is sort of located down near the heart. And I find that if one brings the awareness down there and then really uses that somatic sense, sometimes that can help. So that's one skillful means I find that does is somewhat effective. And honestly, sometimes putting aside some time in meditation to really, allow stuff to percolate is okay as long as it's constrained, saying, 10 minutes here, I'll let myself kind of think about this a little bit. And as long as it's constrained, and I know that I've used the meditative space to make decisions in my life that have been very important, but not to give it full reign over the meditation, especially if it just becomes obvious it's the hindrance. Ajahn?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think most people have had to deal with making certain decisions in your life and in their lives, and if you think about these decisions and how you came to them, and then the results of them, um, hopefully there's some wisdom that's arisen to see that it can sometimes we think that we've made the right decision, and then later it turns out to be the wrong decision for us. Sometimes we make a decision for ourselves and we think that was a great decision, and I'm so happy I made that decision, and look, everything's worked out. But we're also reinforcing the fact that we believe that that was the right decision for us. In fact, that's I think a psychological trait that it can be pointed out through a history of like psychologists researching that topic. The fact that we tend to believe that we've made decisions after we've made them, because they're the decision we made. We want to support that, and so we tend to actually do that and support all the good things that came out of that decision, and denigrate all the bad things that would have possibly come out of the bad decision, or quote unquote other decision. So decision making is kind of difficult, I think, in one realm, because we're trying to predict a future, and the reason that it's difficult, I think, is because we're dealing directly with anicca, and that we're not sure, and that's quite an uncomfortable space to be in. And yet a decision does need to be made. I mean, one could also allow the decision just to be made itself, like, should I go on this trip or not? I have this particular plane ticket, and but I don't think I want to go, and then you just kind of figure it out from there, and maybe you don't go, maybe you do. We let sometimes intuition decide what feels better. But on the other side, once we've made a decision, we really don't know what would have happened if we had made the other decision, because we've then gone towards a stream of the decision we've made. And so all of this is kind of dealing in sort of predictions, and what would have been, and what could have been, and what should be. And so it's not like it's a difficult realm, and I don't think there's an actual answer for how to make sort of the right decision, other than to use one's own wisdom and to know what decisions have been made in the past for yourself, and then to see, like, how you can evaluate that. I think one of the easiest things to do is to really question, is there a moral issue with the decision you're making? And obviously, if there's a moral problem, then you want to side with what is, on the positive moral side. But when it's not a moral decision, and you have to kind of go ahead with something, then it's just not sure. I mean, it's that anicca, that mainea, as they say in Thai, as Ajahn Chah would emphasize, don't know. And so being comfortable with that uncertainty, being comfortable with that not knowing, is a very important part, I think, of being able to go forward with a decision. And to understand that a lot of it is also just sort of random. Like, there might not even just be a right or wrong decision. It's just like, you only know really the results of one decision or the other by making them. So you make one, and then you see, like, what actually happens, and you can't have predicted that exactly in the same way beforehand, because you actually didn't go ahead with an action. Once you do, then you get the results, you get to see where that leads you, and hopefully you have the possibility of changing that in some way. There are possibilities. So really, like, again, like, making a decision also has to do with how we rise up to the particular decision we've made, and the repercussions that come out of that. And so it's not also just like the decision you made and then everything gets figured out from there. It's like, how do we react to that? How do we deal with the experiences that arise out of that particular decision? But definitely when making decisions, I think it's important, as Nisabho was saying, to have, some space, some time, some understanding to actually work with it and try to understand where you're coming from. And it might actually come out to be like, oh yeah, this is what resonates with me. This is the best thing that I should do. But again, it's a little bit woo-woo. It's hard because you're making a future prediction and you can only really compare it to your past, what you've done in the past. So I don't think our kind of how we kind of come to things is always also accurate in terms of how we sort of decide what we're going to do in the future, based on the reality of what actually is at stake or what is going to arise out of this. But we do see once we've gone forward with that. So.
Yeah, Ajahn, and I think sort of speaking about another skillful means I've also found has been the to call to mind a teacher you really respect. Like I call to mind Longpa Pasano and ask him, and frequently that really settles it quite quickly. Another is to look at the tone of each voice in your head, and usually one voice tends to be a bit more oily. Ajahn Amaro calls that the voice of Mara. The other voice has a tone more like solid, steady, like the Buddha. And I find that visualization is very helpful. And another is there's a famous monk from Sri Lanka who's passed now named Venerable Nyanananda. And he spoke about how if you had to summarize the Buddha's teaching in one Pali word, it would be Yawadeva, and which means only for the sake of. And just to say that everything we do as practitioners is for the sake of this path. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. And for me, that settles a lot of issues because so many of decisions are trying to get everything perfect. And if you just think, is it good enough right now for the sake of my practice? Is this relationship good enough? It's not the perfect marriage, but does it let me practice? Is this a kind relationship? Does my partner respect me enough that I can do this? In an example like that, it can put an end to so much of this proliferation if we remember that as practitioners, our Polaris, our North Star, is the cultivation of the heart. And if our conditions are good enough for that, then not getting caught in these quagmires, of proliferation around decisions, but really just, are things good enough? And then put it down and move on towards the goal. Yeah.
Yeah, the more pure you can make your heart through understanding the Dhamma, then decision making, I think, does come easier.
Yeah, it does.
Sort of like you kind of just intuit it, like, oh yeah, why would I have even thought about that? I think it just they do arise. The right things usually of what you want to do arise.
Yeah, and there's sort of a quiet thread of Dhamma that winds through everything, but it just takes some steadiness of hand to track it because it is quiet and subtle.
Yeah. I think like little things you think about, like, oh, was that the right decision or not? And then you can kind of see. But again, I think it's much more helpful after you've made the decision. You do see, oh, how one feels, or we talk about like vipaka kamma, like what are the results of your actions, and you get to see that, and so hopefully that's informing you to a certain degree. Although you can't really know that you were right because kamma is quite difficult to predict. And often we think that's my kamma, but I would challenge that in anyone who would say that, except the Buddha or an arahant necessarily.
Probably not to challenge him.
Yeah,
yes.
but yeah, kamma's it's not. People sometimes say that, but it's not for sure. Buddha talks about that as well, which comes to another question that we've had, I think, with Scott up there about kamma.
Oh, it's true. There was one other question that we got before the session as well.
Oh yes. Okay.
But I think we have time to address them both, Ajahn. We'll start with Scott.
Sure. Yeah.
Scott asks, hello, I have a question about Dhamma and Kamma. When strong emotions arise, the way they arise is due to causes and conditions. Dhamma seems to be the reality which permeates all reality. These two statements can lead to confusion. I would very much appreciate a comment which may clarify.
Well, I'm not sure the two that you're talking about, because I see one. I see the question about strong emotions and coming from causes and conditions, and then Dhamma, a reality which permeates all reality. Um, yeah, so that I guess I would tease out that the fact that the Dhamma is kind of something that I think we can be a little bit clearer on, whereas Kamma, um, the understanding of Kamma is quite difficult, and I might have stated before that the Buddha said that to not only just is contemplating it, and but trying to actually put one's mind to it and understand it, uh, can lead to one's head exploding. So, and the Buddha said he was, as a Buddha can actually fully understand Kamma, but most beings cannot, including not all arahants, to fully understand it. Um, and you can kind of think about it like why that would be the case, like relating all of the sort of the reasons why we think something happened, or we kind of trace it. um, that could really, there could be any reasons for that, and it's very hard. One has to see into the depths of the mind, into the depths of Dhamma, to really understand that, and that takes not only, I think, a fair amount of development, um, or past life development, but it's not easy to see. And it's also important to note that I have to chide myself for not having memorized this sutta, but there's a sutta where the Buddha basically says that not everything is due to Kamma, and that might surprise people that he said that, but sort of like Freud saying sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's like
He said that? That's
yeah.
great.
There's not Kamma is something that is just one factor for why things happen. It's one of several factors. The Buddha actually had like 7 factors, and some of them were like, he was talking a bit about what would seem like health related, can be like the temperature, weather. It can be all kinds of reasons that that there are the sort of the arising of sort of the conditions that we find ourselves in, or we see around us. And so it's important that you might hear people, or you might even say, "Oh, that's my Kamma," but be careful. I would suggest, because I surely have had to tame that inside of myself to not actually say that, because I don't know. I don't know that that's my Kamma. I can suspect, but I can't know. And so when I think like, oh, this happened because that happened, I can kind of see like a pattern, and maybe that's what I can see, maybe correlation. But causation is very hard and very difficult to put something to. So in terms of understanding like emotion, it's not always just based on like one's Kamma. I mean, again, you could be uncomfortable because of the temperature of the room, or you could have some problem in your body that's causing a particular emotion to come up. It's not necessarily because you like harmed your sister in your past life or whatever. There are lots of reasons. So I do see, though, that the question around Dhamma, and that in terms of what Scott's saying around it, that it seems to be the reality which permeates all reality. I would say, well, actually, the Dhamma is sort of reality. It is sort of the experience. The Buddha was basically talking about, like the Four Noble Truths and what he meant by the Dhamma, and it's kind of like a lens by which we can really understand what is actually happening through experience. It's sort of essentially a phenomenological understanding, and so that's what we're trying to do with everything we're understanding, and what the Buddha is encouraging us in terms of his teachings is to see that. And he is also trying to work with a framework around Kamma, but also to encourage us not to be so sure of those things. So I think that essentially confusion is correct. I think there is confusion and delusion. That's going to be present until one's enlightened. And so kind of get used to it, but also hopefully get used to it it decreasing, the more that you practice with this, as you were talking about, this reality that permeates all reality, the sort of the Dhamma aspect of it. And eventually, hopefully you will see and understand Kamma more. Maybe not to its fullest extent, but you will be able to see, oh, okay, because of these things that I'm seeing that are related, I can actually have an impact on my own experience, and then I can suffer less. So that's the sort of reality I think we're trying to get in contact with.
Mm. Yeah, no, I agree, and I think, I mean, I sort of, don't worry, Scott. It's these are difficult issues. You don't have to apologize for lack of clarity.
Oh,
What
don't
I
apologize. Good question.
what I took your question to mean, was a bit, how can these negative things, such as strong emotions that are caused through the underlying strata of Dhamma, arise when they seem unwholesome, but Dhamma at its heart is truth, or something of that nature, and that karma is, how do these things coexist? And I'm unsure if I'm interpreting your question correctly, but to speak to what Ajahn Chunda is saying around increasingly gaining more understanding and confusion lessening, I think, the Buddha spoke about how there's several suttas, including in the Samyutta Nikaya 1220, where he speaks about these three characteristics that are sort of counterbalanced against the usual characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and not self. And he says the invariability of Dhamma, the unchangingness of Dhamma, that is conditional, sorry, conditionality. So titawasa datu, dhammatitata, dhammaniyamata, idapachayata. And what I think he's speaking there too is that how things arise, that process is stable and unchanging, and that's the Dhamma. You look at what the Buddha's, what he speaks about his insight on the night of his enlightenment being, and it is how suffering comes into being, the 12 links of dependent origination. And that process produces strong mind states, is propelled by Kamma, produces negative emotions, produces all suffering. But the process itself has this quality of stability. And I think what he's pointing to in that sutta is the fact that the more we understand that process, the more the heart finds refuge in a sense that things aren't wrong. And I think we have that intuitive sense. It's once you find out why something has come into being, the heart is okay with it because it understands that it belongs. And so say a strong mind state or emotion brought up by Kamma as you're speaking to, say one had a trauma in childhood and then, experiences based on some trivial event, this huge emotional reaction. Initially, one could have a great deal of suffering and ask oneself, why am I having this? This is completely out of proportion. But then as you track the causes and conditions back and say, oh, this is from my childhood, of course, there's this reaction, it's resonating there. More and more the heart understands all the conditions that came together to cause that. And there's a stability and a sense of things being okay in that, and of the Dhamma holding one. So I'd say the process is the Dhamma, and that is a refuge. But what it produces is suffering and these damaging mind states. But as we understand the process more, the suffering becomes less and less a problem, and we let go of it little by little. But for me, that's how the two things coexist, is the process is the Dhamma. And what comes out of it, yes, this is suffering. But as we understand the process more, and the heart widens to know more and more of how our suffering comes into being, then things are okay. Yeah, maybe.
No, I mean it's interesting too, because you think about it, how the Buddha talked about his discovery of the Dhamma anyway, and how it's like, it was already there. It's not something that's like that he is the sole person who either created, or that he's the only person who's ever found it. So it's sort of like it's ever pervasive. It's there, that to be discovered, to be individually understood by the wise, and so that is what we're touching into more and more. But it takes time to develop that kind of wisdom, and to really try to understand why it is that we suffer. And I think it's, from an intellectual level, most of us can understand it and see it, but from an experiential level, it just takes a very long time to really discover that Dhamma, to discover really how this all works. So yeah, that's good.
And you do realize, like, yeah, as these neurotic like patterns we have as adults, like if you just track them back to like how they helped you survive as a kid, it just makes it so much, there's so much compassion hidden there. You get why you're like this, and we're all neurotic, awkward, broken creatures, but
Yeah, and also the fact that it's just the Buddha, the cornerstone of his teaching is there's not a self. Essentially, there's not a sense that this is who and what I am, as permanent kind of entity. And so that's such an important aspect of that understanding, because we want to keep making it permanent, like I'm a neurotic person, or I'm a bad person, or I have these problems, and why do I have these problems, or I shouldn't have these problems, and it's all me focused. And whereas if we take the self out of that, we see that, oh, okay, like there's not a personal identity I really need to form around this. This is just dukkha. This is the sort of unfortunate aspect of what we live with as human beings, that we are going to have strong emotions and painful experiences, but we don't actually have to suffer, and that's what we're learning. And the suffering is often the kind of why me, and the whole me aspect. So as soon as we kind of get the me out of the way, then we learn through that impersonal process, oh, like, well, it is painful. It does kind of suck to be human sometimes. But it doesn't mean that there has to be this kind of like permanence of who and what I am, and why I'm the cause and the reason, and I'm to blame for everything. So
that's a really good point, Ajahn.
Yeah, sort of good way to look at it, I think. Did we want to try to?
I said we would, and it's a good question.
Right.
Sorry if those who want to sign off can, but this is a good question that we should address. Someone asked the question that if Longpo Sumedho speaks about being the knowing, or intuitive awareness quite frequently, how should we interpret this concept? How does it fit into the broader systems of practice the Buddha spoke of? For example, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, being the knowing. And how does it sort of overlay onto our lives in general in a healthy way? Yes. Okay. So I think that, I think it's a powerful phrase, and Longpo Sumedho is known for the simplicity of his teachings, in terms of their sort of powerful simplicity. I find that different people have different temperaments in this, and some people do really gravitate towards, say, a mantra, a phrase in meditation, for example, be the knowing, and it does help them step back from experience a bit. However, I'm also, one has to consider that Longpo Sumedho is using that recollection in tandem with a life of giving, of extreme activity. I mean, he was setting up Amaravati, a huge monastery, looking after nuns and monks, and studying the Dhamma. So that is to say that I think as Westerners frequently the Dhamma gets translated here, and we're so attracted to the high wisdom teachings, such as Be the Knowing, and we forget that um, there's all these steps and foundations that those recollections rest on that are very important to cultivate. So the 10 spiritual perfections, they do end with, they do have wisdom in there and equanimity, equanimity, the final of the 10, which I think could correspond in many ways to Be the Knowing. It's that sort of equanimous stepping back. But the first step in those 10 is dana, giving. And, you know, just these foundations of a life are essential. And in terms of providing a foundation for these higher wisdom teachings. And similarly, you look at the progression of the mindfulness of breathing sutta, and it moves through becoming acquainted with the body in the first four steps, the first tetrad, becoming acquainted with feelings in the second tetrad, the second four steps, and then only in the third four steps, the third tetrad, does one come to awareness of the mind. So in formal practice, I think for many people, it's really important to become aware of how to use and be with the body, and only then do these sort of mantras or these sort of higher wisdom teachings really maintain their power. And so I find for many people it's important to have a wider scope of practice, both in terms of the sitting meditation and the wider scope of a life. And then those practices can be very helpful. But if it's just one phrase that one is leaning on, I think it can be very hard. And I think it's rare someone can really progress with just one phrase as the foundation of their whole practice.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a phrase to use. So it's something that when you find it useful to bring up for yourself, you can bring up for yourself. But it's not the whole of the Buddha's teachings. He taught a lot. I'm looking at just 3 of the Nikayas right now. It's a lot of stuff. But that's, it's I think it's important, as you were saying, Nisabho, like that there's a lot of practice that goes into development, and Lumpur Sumedho surely has, through just speaking about his own life, has gone through an enormous amount of development in his life. And it makes sense that, later on, just for any of you, you'd probably come up with some things that you've learned for yourselves and go, oh, I just got to remind myself of this particular phrase, or I find this useful to say to myself. And I think for Lumpur, intuitive awareness, Be the Knowing, those are things that for him really were helpful to recite for himself. I know that one of the very senior monks in our tradition, who's very well known, said that he just tried Be the Knowing for many, many years, and he just got depressed and eventually moved towards more like just using the Buddha's instructions on Anapanasati, and found that much more grounding, and he became less depressed. And so I think that a phrase like that can be very helpful. For me, it's helpful to use that sometimes as well. Especially in times where the mind is just not wanting to be the knowing, it's just wanting to know. And so, there could be a lot of thought and papancha, kind of the papancha mill going on. Most of us know what this is like, just to think a lot, try to think ourselves through something, or to not recognize we're doing that in our meditation experience. And then just like that simple phrase, Be the Knowing, is more an example of like, oh, like all I have to do is just simply know what's happening. That's I can at least fall back on that right now. I remember talking to Lumpur Sumedho about that, with using the nada sound, and how it can be difficult because in terms of listening to this sound, which is essentially like, I would just equate to tinnitus, these kind of hearing like a high-pitched noise, which I thought literally for much of my life was actually just what like the earth sounded like, or what it was like when you sat down. You just heard this kind of pitch, and I thought everybody heard that, but that it was coming from an external source, until I realized it wasn't. The point that I'm making though is that I was telling him it was hard because as I would notice the pitches in a more refined kind of sensing of them or hearing them, I would notice these different pitches going on, and it was distracting to the mind because it was like, it wasn't kind of like necessarily as focused as the breath, because the pitches were high and low and moving from left to right. And that's where he used be the knowing. He just said, well, just know the mind trying to figure out, which pitch or what I'm trying to focus on, or know the mind that is floating between certain pitches. And that's just something else to experience and to know, rather than get caught into pancha or frustration or aversion around it, or desire for it to just have a fixed experience for oneself. So that's, I think that's where his phrase is quite helpful, is it just allows the mind to rely on, like, well, what is intuitive awareness? It's just sort of knowing, like trusting. He often says trusting in awareness. And so one has a sense of like just being in that sense of knowing and being okay with that knowing, rather than trying to find a better experience or a different experience or the right experience. It's just we'll just know the experience. And so when we start to rest in that, I think that's why that phrase has worked for Lumpur. And I can't speak for him directly, but for my own sense with it, it's more of, oh, right, I don't need to think about myself. As Lumpur Sumedho says, that's when I think about myself, I just feel depressed. And it's true, like if you don't think about yourself very much, it's not that complicated. And there can be an intuition that is held within one's own mind about what sort of the right thing is to do with one's sense of knowing. So I just find returning to that sense of awareness, and the idea of intuition is like, keep trusting in what feels right, and what the experience of like just that continual falling back on, what do I know right now? I just know this is happening right now. This is what the experience is. I don't have to necessarily define it or pigeonhole it or push away a certain experience or move towards something or whatever it might be. And so that's where the trust comes in, is just stop kind of trying to be something and do something, and just allow experience to be what it is. And then the mind can rest in that. Without that, that sense of kind of sort of relaxing into that intuition, then we're just going to keep moving. And it's like that still force pool that Ajahn Chah is referring to. It's like, it's neither falling back or trying to move forward, but it's not also in the sitting still, because sitting still is still an attempt to try to do something in the present moment. So the more that we trust that, then we can kind of relax and just the mind being present. That's just one way to kind of think about it.
Yeah.
And with
Definitely.
that, we're approaching an hour, so I think we can maybe save some questions, another question for next time, for Samrit and others.
Yeah.
And it's been nice to be with you tonight.
Likewise.
It's been nice to be with Venerable Nisabho.
Ajahn, Nick, get thee to a monastery.
Yeah.
You remember.
So yes, take care, and Tan Nisabho will see you on Friday.
If we don't die, as usual.
Yes.
Okay.